April 5th, 1956. Lindy's Restaurant, Broadway and 51st Street, Manhattan. Victor Riesel stepped into the night air after finishing his cheesecake, the spring cold biting through his overcoat. A labor columnist for the New York Daily Mirror, Riesel had spent the evening working on his next exposé. Another piece dissecting the manufactured union locals spreading through New York's garment district like a virus in silk. He didn't notice the man trailing 10 paces behind. Abraham Telvey had been waiting for 3 hours, a small vial tucked into his jacket pocket. Sulfuric acid, industrial grade, enough to destroy a man's face and silence a typewriter forever. The attack took 4 seconds. Riesel screamed. Telvey ran. By morning, Victor Riesel would never see another sunrise, and the man who ordered the hit would be sipping espresso in a midtown hotel lounge, signing paperwork with a fountain pen, his manicured hands steady as a surgeon's. Johnny Dio didn't look like a monster. That was the entire point. Born Giovanni Ignazio Dioguardi in 1914 to Italian immigrants in Manhattan's Lower East Side, he grew up watching the neighborhood's power brokers, the men who controlled pushcarts, who decided which fruit vendor worked which corner, who settled disputes with a word instead of a fist. The lesson imprinted early: visible violence was crude. True power lived in paperwork and the ability to make legitimacy itself a weapon. While other young men on Mulberry Street were learning to crack skulls, Dio was learning to read contracts. By age 16, he discovered the garment district, that dense square mile where hundreds of millions of dollars in dresses, coats, and suits moved through narrow streets on the backs of underpaid truckers. The district operated on a simple principle: stop the trucks, stop the money. Dio saw the elegance immediately. You didn't need to rob a business. You just needed to make it impossible for them to operate. His entry into organized crime came through labor racketeering, but not the kind most people imagined. Dio rarely threw a punch. Instead, he perfected something far more insidious: the manufactured labor dispute. The system worked with theatrical precision. A garment manufacturer would refuse to pay protection. Within days, a picket line materialized outside their building. 8 to 12 men carrying professionally printed signs reading "Unfair Labor Practice" or "Management Refuses to Negotiate." The protesters had never worked for the company. Many had never worked in the garment industry at all. They were actors in a carefully orchestrated performance, paid daily wages to stand and chant. To the public, it looked like legitimate labor activism. To the manufacturers, suppliers, and buyers, it looked like trouble. Trucks stopped arriving. Orders got canceled. Credit lines tightened. The business began hemorrhaging money, sometimes thousands of dollars daily, all because of a protest that cost Dio maybe $300 to maintain. Then came the solution. A well-dressed man would appear at the manufacturer's office, introducing himself as a labor consultant from Equitable Research Associates. He'd express sympathy for the owner's predicament, suggest that the labor dispute seemed unnecessary, mention that he had certain connections to union leadership. Perhaps for a modest fee and the signing of a collective bargaining agreement with a particular union local, the protest could be resolved. The manufacturer, desperate and bleeding money, would sign. The picket line would vanish overnight. The new union contract would be absurdly favorable to management. Low wages, minimal benefits, no actual worker protections. Because the union wasn't real. It was what investigators later called a paper local, a chartered union with no genuine members, existing solely on documents filed with the American Federation of Labor. Dio controlled dozens of these phantom organizations, each one a tool for extortion disguised as labor relations. The genius wasn't just the scam itself, it was Dio's presentation. He operated from hotel lounges, not social clubs, the Waldorf Astoria, the Plaza, the St. Regis. He wore tailored suits from Brooks Brothers, drank scotch at lunch with legitimate businessmen, carried a leather briefcase that contained union charters the way other men carried weapons. Law enforcement found him infuriating precisely because he fit none of their stereotypes. FBI surveillance photos from 1953 show him leaving the 21 Club with a city councilman and two lawyers, everyone smiling. No suspicious packages, no furtive glances, just a consultant heading to his next appointment. His business cards listed him as a labor relations specialist. His tax returns showed income from consulting fees and real estate investments. On paper, Johnny Dio looked more legitimate than most actual businessmen. And that was exactly how he designed it. By 1952, Dio's operation had expanded beyond simple extortion. He'd recognized something crucial. Union charters were currency in the underworld. Legitimate labor unions operated through a complex hierarchy. Local chapters reported to regional bodies, which reported to national leadership. Elections determined officers. Members voted on contracts. The process created accountability, but also vulnerability. A determined criminal could hijack the system by controlling enough locals to swing regional elections. And if those locals were phantoms, organizations with a charter but no actual workers, you could manufacture voting power from thin air. This realization brought Dio into orbit with James Riddle Hoffa, a rising Teamsters official in Detroit who shared Dio's appreciation for bureaucratic manipulation. Hoffa needed to secure the Teamsters presidency, but he faced opposition from existing union leadership, men who actually represented workers and resisted mob infiltration. The solution required manufacturing enough votes to overwhelm them. In 1955, Dio created 7 new Teamsters locals in New York City within a 6-week span. Local 257. Local 258. Local 269. Local 270. Local 284. Local 362. Local 651. Sequential. Manufactured. Each received a legitimate charter from the AFL-CIO. Each had officers listed in union directories. Each submitted the required paperwork and paid the necessary dues. And each was completely fictitious. The locals existed only in filing cabinets and on ballots. The bureaucratic horror of it was the precision. These weren't random numbers scattered across the city, but a systematic assembly line of phantom organizations churned out like counterfeit bills to flood New York Teamster Joint Council 16 with fabricated voting power. When the Teamsters held their 1957 convention in Miami, these phantom locals cast votes that helped deliver Hoffa the presidency. The scheme worked flawlessly, until Senator John McClellan of Arkansas decided to investigate labor racketeering and hired a young, ambitious attorney named Robert F. Kennedy as chief counsel. The Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, known simply as the McClellan Committee, began hearings in January 1957. Kennedy had spent months preparing, gathering testimony from manufacturers who'd been extorted, examining union records, building a case against the paper local system. When Johnny Dio received his subpoena, he initially planned to invoke the Fifth Amendment and remain silent. But Kennedy had a different strategy. He didn't just want to expose Dio's criminal activities. He wanted to destroy the carefully cultivated image of respectability that made those activities possible. The hearings were televised. Millions of Americans watched. And Kennedy orchestrated the proceedings like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument to the nation. The confrontation began professionally enough. Dio arrived at the Senate hearing room in a charcoal suit, his hair perfectly combed, his demeanor calm. He sat before the committee with his lawyer, answered the initial questions with polite refusal. "I respectfully decline to answer on grounds that it may tend to incriminate me," and maintained his composure. Kennedy methodically walked through the evidence. Fake union charters, testimonies from terrorized businessmen, financial records showing payoffs. Dio remained stoic, occasionally whispering to his attorney, projecting an air of a man wrongly accused. Then Kennedy played his ace. He produced photographs, surveillance images, and crime scene photos, and asked Dio to identify certain individuals, certain locations, certain moments. The questions grew more pointed. Kennedy's voice sharpened. He wasn't just interrogating Dio, he was performing for the cameras, demonstrating that beneath the expensive suit sat not a consultant, but a predator. Something broke. Perhaps it was the accumulation of accusations. Perhaps it was seeing his carefully constructed facade dismantled on national television. Perhaps it was simply the look on Kennedy's face, that Kennedy knew everything and was enjoying the exposure. In August 1957, as Dio was being led out of the hearing area during a recess, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions and angling for photographs. A photographer named Stanley Tredick moved in for a close shot. Dio lunged. The moment was captured by other photographers. Johnny Dio, the composed professional, transformed into a snarling animal, hands reaching for Tredick's camera equipment, face contorted with rage. The image appeared in newspapers nationwide. In a single unguarded second, Dio had undone years of carefully cultivated legitimacy. The public saw what he really was. The suit didn't matter anymore. The hotel lounges meant nothing. America watched a mobster reveal himself, and they understood that everything else had been theater. But the McClellan hearings merely formalized what federal investigators had already suspected. The Victor Riesel attack had been Dio's critical mistake, the crime that transformed him from a sophisticated racketeer into a national target. Riesel hadn't been just any journalist. His syndicated column appeared in nearly 200 newspapers, reaching millions of readers daily. He'd made a career exposing union corruption, naming names, connecting criminal organizations to specific labor locals. By early 1956, Riesel had focused his attention on Dio's operation, writing detailed accounts of the paper local system, the manufactured picket lines, the way legitimate labor activism was being weaponized for extortion. Each column eroded Dio's protective camouflage. Businessmen who might have paid quietly now questioned whether cooperation would truly guarantee protection. Law enforcement gained public pressure to act. Riesel's typewriter posed an existential threat to Dio's entire operation. The decision to eliminate Riesel came with cold calculation. Dio understood that killing a prominent journalist would generate massive law enforcement response. But he also understood that the alternative, allowing Riesel to continue publishing, would gradually dismantle his organization through exposure. He chose the immediate tactical move over the long strategic retreat. The contract went to Abraham Telvey, a small-time hood with a history of violent crime. Telvey wasn't a sophisticated operator. He was blunt force, a man willing to commit horrific acts for cash. Dio never met him directly. The instructions traveled through intermediaries. Blind the columnist outside Lindy's restaurant sometime after midnight, when the street traffic thinned. The payment was $1,175, an odd transactional figure that carried the authenticity of mob accounting. Not a rounded sum, but a specific amount negotiated down to the last bill. No one explained the full consequences to Telvey. No one mentioned that attacking one of New York's most prominent journalists would trigger the largest manhunt in the city's history. The attack itself took 4 seconds. but its reverberations echoed for years. Riesel survived, physically at least. The acid destroyed his eyes, but not his voice. He continued his column, dictating to assistants, attending hearings, testifying. His blindness became a symbol, a visible reminder of what happened when criminals felt threatened by scrutiny. Federal authorities flooded the investigation with resources. The FBI, NYPD, and District Attorney's Office coordinated efforts with unusual efficiency. Within weeks, they'd identified Telvey. Within months, they'd connected him to Dio through intermediaries. And Telvey, facing life in prison for the attack, began considering cooperation. He hadn't understood what he'd signed up for. Blinding a journalist carried different weight than beating up a garment district manager. The pressure was immense. Federal prosecutors offered deals. Telvey wavered. Dio moved first. On July 28, 1956, Abraham Telvey's body was discovered on Mulberry Street, shot twice in the head at close range. The murder happened blocks from Dio's childhood home, a message to anyone who understood the neighborhood's language. Telvey had become a liability the moment he'd accepted the Riesel contract, and his murder eliminated the most direct link between Dio and the acid attack. But it also confirmed what investigators suspected. Dio was willing to order killings to protect his operation. The sophisticated consultant image dissolved further. Prosecutors redoubled their efforts. Without Telvey, they couldn't make the acid charges stick. The main witness was dead, others refused to talk, and the direct evidence connecting Dio to the blinding had vanished with the triggerman. But they didn't need the Riesel case. They had something better, a federal hammer called labor racketeering. In 1957, Dio was convicted of extortion and conspiracy related to his labor rackets and sentenced to 15 years. The conviction didn't mention Riesel's name, but everyone understood the connection. The journalist's blindness had focused federal attention with such intensity that prosecutors found every other crime Dio had committed, built an airtight case, and buried him in the legal system even without proving the attack itself. He appealed, delayed, exhausted every legal avenue. But by 1960, the cell door at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary finally closed behind him. Most criminals found prison diminishing, a stripping away of identity and power, a reduction to a number in a cell. Johnny Dio found it merely inconvenient. The institutional structure of prison actually suited him. Rules, hierarchies, the importance of connections and favors. Prison operated on principles Dio had exploited his entire career. Within months, he'd established himself as one of Lewisburg's most influential inmates. He didn't run the prison through violence. He ran it through the same methods he'd used outside, identifying what people needed, positioning himself as the solution, building a network of obligations and reciprocal favors. Henry Hill, the Lacaze family associate who later became famous through Goodfellas, served time at Lewisburg and witnessed Dio's operation firsthand. Hill's accounts describe a man who transformed a prison cell into an office. Dio cooked elaborate Italian meals using ingredients smuggled in by guards he'd cultivated. He maintained connections to the outside, receiving regular updates on his business interests, issuing instructions through visitors and corrupted mail systems. He drank wine, actual wine, not prison hooch, served in proper glasses. Guards who cooperated found cash waiting for their families on the outside. Guards who didn't cooperate found themselves transferred or investigated for minor infractions by internal affairs divisions that had somehow taken sudden interest in their activities. Dio's power behind bars was so pronounced that federal authorities eventually transferred him to other facilities, hoping to disrupt his influence. It didn't matter. He established himself wherever he went. The location changed. The dynamic didn't. Prison also provided time for reflection and evolution. Dio watched from behind bars as federal legislation, partially inspired by his own crimes, reshaped American labor law. The Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959 imposed new requirements on union elections, financial disclosures, and internal governance. The paper-local strategy, manufacturing phantom unions to control elections, became significantly harder to execute. The law hadn't been designed to stop Dio specifically, but his operation had been so blatant, so successful, and so publicly exposed through the McClellan hearings that legislators used him as a template for what needed preventing. Dio recognized a crucial pattern. Traditional labor racketeering was becoming untenable. Law enforcement had adapted. Legislation had caught up. The profitable angle wasn't forcing businessmen to sign sweetheart contracts anymore. The future belonged to different forms of institutional manipulation. He began studying securities law, not with textbooks and lawyers initially, but through conversations with other inmates. White-collar criminals serving sentences for stock fraud, embezzlement, securities manipulation. Lewisburg housed a diverse population of federal offenders, and Dio used his time to network upward, cultivating relationships with men who'd stolen millions through paperwork rather than violence. The pattern intrigued him. A stock swindle could generate more money than a year of labor extortion with virtually no physical risk. The complexity served as protection. Judges and juries struggled to understand intricate financial schemes, and the punishment for securities fraud, even when convicted, rarely matched sentences for labor racketeering or violent crimes. Dio began positioning himself for a transformation. When he eventually left prison, he wouldn't return to union charters. He'd move into corporate shells, pump and dump schemes, and the manipulation of publicly traded companies. His release came in 1968 after serving 8 years of his sentence. He was 54 years old, a middle-aged man emerging into a country that had changed significantly during his incarceration. The labor movement faced different pressures. The mafia's influence in unions had diminished, though not disappeared. Federal oversight had intensified, but the stock market had exploded. New wealth flooding into equities and regulatory enforcement struggled to keep pace with increasingly sophisticated fraud schemes. Dio saw the opportunity immediately. He'd spent years preparing, learning the mechanics of securities manipulation from fellow inmates, understanding how shell corporations could be created, traded, and dissolved. He became involved with several penny stock operations, companies that existed primarily on paper, generating shares that were marketed aggressively to unsuspecting investors through boiler room tactics. High-pressure phone sales operations that promised incredible returns on worthless stock. One operation involved Mastercraft Electronics, a company that claimed to manufacture advanced audio equipment, but actually produced almost nothing. Dio helped orchestrate the scheme. Insiders purchased shares at pennies per unit, then launched an aggressive marketing campaign touting the company's revolutionary technology and imminent breakthroughs. Stock prices artificially inflated as small investors bought in. Once prices peaked, insiders dumped their shares, pocketing the difference while the stock collapsed, leaving later investors holding worthless certificates. The scheme was classic pump and dump, but Dio's sophistication lay in the layers of corporate structure insulating him from direct prosecution. He didn't own the company. He merely consulted. He provided introductions, facilitated connections, offered advice. When regulators eventually investigated Mastercraft, they found a maze of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and intermediaries. Dio's name appeared nowhere in the official records, yet everyone involved understood who'd architected the operation. This represented Dio's final evolution, from street-level muscle to labor racketeer to white-collar criminal. Each transition had taken him further from visible violence and deeper into systemic manipulation. The early garment district work had required periodic shows of force: beatings, property destruction, implied threats. The paper local system had been cleaner, using legal mechanisms as weapons, but it still occasionally demanded violence, as the Riesel attack demonstrated. Securities fraud eliminated even that residual brutality. The victims never saw their attacker. They received phone calls from persuasive salesmen, read prospectuses that promised prosperity, signed documents transferring money into schemes they didn't understand. By the time they realized they'd been defrauded, the money had vanished through corporate structures designed precisely for that purpose, and the people who'd taken it were protected by lawyers who specialized in creating plausible deniability. Federal authorities prosecuted Dio again in 1973, this time for conspiracy to commit securities fraud. The trial was complex, requiring prosecutors to explain shell corporations, stock manipulation, and boiler room operations to a jury that struggled with the technical details. Dio's defense attorneys argued he'd merely provided legitimate consulting services, that he couldn't be held responsible for how others used his advice, that the prosecution was persecuting him because of his past convictions rather than proving current crimes. The strategy almost worked. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They convicted on some counts, acquitted on others. Dio received a lighter sentence than his earlier labor racketeering conviction: 5 years, precisely because securities fraud, despite stealing more money and harming more people, was perceived as less serious than the violence-adjacent crimes of his youth. He returned to Lewisburg in 1974, now 60 years old, his transformation from street criminal to white-collar operator complete. This second incarceration differed from the first. Dio's health had declined. The prison population had changed, younger and more violent. The influence he'd once wielded diminished. But he maintained connections, continued operating businesses through proxies, and demonstrated the fundamental reality he'd understood his entire career. Power derived not from physical strength, but from positioning oneself as an essential node in networks of commerce, information, and influence. Even elderly and imprisoned, Dio provided value to people on the outside. Introductions, advice, institutional memory about how certain systems worked. He remained relevant because he'd spent decades making himself indispensable, building relationships that outlasted any single venture or scheme. The cultural impact of his career extended beyond his direct crimes. The 1954 film On the Waterfront, Elia Kazan's masterpiece about union corruption on New York's docks, drew from the broader pattern of labor racketeering that Dio exemplified. The movie's portrayal of union locals controlled by mobsters, of workers terrorized into silence, of violence deployed to protect institutional power. These elements reflected the reality Dio had helped create in the garment district. The film won 8 Academy Awards and shaped how Americans understood the intersection of organized crime and labor unions. Similarly, Ronnie James Dio, the legendary heavy metal vocalist, adopted his stage name partly because Dio projected power and mystery. He'd later explained that the name came from mobster Johnny Dio, whose reputation for sophisticated criminality appealed to the singer's desire for a persona that suggested both danger and intelligence. Even in popular culture, Dio's influence rippled outward, his name becoming synonymous with a particular kind of criminal elegance. The broader significance of his career lies in what it revealed about institutional vulnerability. Violence, while destructive, was visible and provoked immediate response. Law enforcement knew how to handle shootings, beatings, intimidation. The legal system had centuries of precedent for prosecuting murder and assault. But Dio demonstrated that manipulating legitimate institutions, labor unions, corporations, stock markets, could be more profitable, more sustainable, and harder to prosecute than traditional organized crime. He weaponized legitimacy itself, turning the very mechanisms designed to protect workers and investors into tools for exploitation. This innovation made him far more dangerous than a simple enforcer. Street violence hurt individuals. Institutional corruption degraded the systems millions of people depended on, eroding trust in unions, corporations, and markets. The damage was diffuse but profound, creating cynicism about whether any institution truly served its stated purpose or simply concealed someone's racket. The legal reforms his crimes inspired, the Landrum-Griffin Act, enhanced SEC enforcement, RICO statutes, reflected lawmakers' recognition that organized crime had evolved beyond what existing laws could address. These reforms didn't target individual criminals, they targeted methodologies, the systematic exploitation of regulatory gaps, and institutional trust. But legislation always lagged behind criminal innovation. Dio understood this. Each new law created new vulnerabilities to exploit. Each reform designed to prevent yesterday's scheme suggested tomorrow's opportunity. The cycle continued because criminals willing to study institutional structures could identify weaknesses faster than legislators could patch them. Dio's career provided the template. Find legitimate systems that depend on the trust and paperwork. Identify where oversight is weakest. Exploit the gap until law enforcement catches up. Then pivot to the next vulnerable system. Johnny Dio died of natural causes on January 12, 1979, in a Pennsylvania hospital, still serving his sentence. He was 64 years old, had spent more than 20 years of his life in federal prison, and had transformed how organized crime operated in America. His death received modest media coverage, a few obituaries noting his role in the Riesel blinding, his convictions for labor racketeering and securities fraud, his connection to Hoffa's rise in the Teamsters. But the full scope of his influence was harder to quantify. How do you measure the impact of teaching the mafia that paperwork could be more powerful than violence? How do you calculate the damage from normalizing institutional corruption, from demonstrating that legitimate structures could be hollowed out and worn as disguises? The garment district continued functioning long after Dio's death, though his paper local system eventually collapsed under federal scrutiny. Legitimate unions reclaimed many of the locals he'd hijacked. Workers gained real representation, actual contracts that provided meaningful protections. But the scars remained. Manufacturers who'd been extorted had closed. Workers who'd been terrorized had left the industry. Trust between labor and management had fractured, creating adversarial relationships that persisted for decades. The district never fully recovered the cooperative spirit that had existed before men like Dio demonstrated how easily it could all be corrupted. And beyond the garment district, Dio's methods spread. The pump and dump schemes he helped refine in the 1960s became standard practice in penny stock fraud. The boiler room tactics evolved into telemarketing scams and eventually internet fraud. The fundamental insight that institutional legitimacy could mask criminal intent became doctrine for white-collar criminals worldwide. Federal prosecutors who'd spent years pursuing Dio recognized the pattern. In interviews after his death, several acknowledged that while they'd eventually imprisoned him, they'd never truly stopped him. His influence had metastasized, spreading through organized crime networks and beyond, teaching a generation of criminals that sophistication beat brutality, that infiltrating institutions produced better returns than robbing them directly. The FBI maintained files on dozens of individuals who'd learned from Dio's example, who'd taken his methods into new industries, securities, real estate, healthcare fraud, insurance schemes. The fundamental approach remained consistent. Identify a system built on trust and paperwork. Find its vulnerabilities, exploit them systematically while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. Dio hadn't invented institutional corruption, but he'd perfected it, demonstrated its profitability, and showed how long someone could operate before the law caught up. The Riesel attack remained his most notorious crime, the act that ultimately destroyed his carefully cultivated image and made him a priority target for federal authorities. Victor Riesel himself, blind but unbowed, continued his column until 1990, outliving Dio by more than a decade. He never recovered his sight, but he maintained his voice, continuing to expose labor corruption, mob infiltration of unions, and the ongoing challenge of protecting workers from criminal exploitation. In his final columns, Riesel occasionally mentioned Dio, not with bitterness, but with a kind of grim acknowledgement that the fight against institutional corruption was eternal, that defeating one architect of paper locals simply meant others would emerge, perhaps more sophisticated, certainly more careful. Riesel's blindness served as permanent testimony to what happened when criminals felt threatened by exposure, and as a reminder that journalism, real investigation, carried genuine risks when it confronted powerful interests. The question Dio's career poses isn't whether one criminal can corrupt entire systems. Clearly they can, but whether those systems possess sufficient resilience to expel corruption once it's embedded. Labor unions eventually reformed, though it took federal legislation, internal oversight, and decades of effort. Securities markets developed better regulatory frameworks, though pump and dump schemes still flourish in less regulated spaces. The pattern suggests that institutional corruption, once established, never fully disappears. It adapts, migrates to new industries, exploits emerging technologies. Dio used paper charters and shell corporations. Modern criminals use cryptocurrency, dark web marketplaces, algorithmic trading. The tools change. The methodology endures. What made Johnny Dio historically significant wasn't any single crime, but his systematic demonstration that organized crime could abandon its traditional methods and still flourish. He proved that violence, while sometimes necessary, was often counterproductive, too visible, too easily prosecuted, too likely to provoke overwhelming law enforcement response. Better to corrupt systems from within, to make criminality look like normal business operations, to position oneself as a consultant or facilitator rather than a gangster. This insight transformed American organized crime more than any single law enforcement victory or mob war. It represented an evolutionary leap, a recognition that the future belonged not to soldiers, but to criminals who understood spreadsheets, who could read corporate law, who knew how to exploit regulatory gaps. The mafia family that adopted these methods survived and prospered. Those that clung to traditional approaches, violence, territory, visible hierarchy, gradually withered under law enforcement pressure. An empty boardroom, a stack of union charters and stock certificates sitting on polished wood. Outside, the city continues, trucks moving goods, workers clocking in, investors buying shares, all of it functioning on trust, on the assumption that institutions work as advertised, that charters mean something, that certificates have value. Johnny Dio understood that this trust was a vulnerability, that the gap between how systems claim to work and how they actually function created space for operators sophisticated enough to exploit it. He built a career in that gap, accumulating wealth and power not through the crude tools of traditional crime, but through the quiet manipulation of paperwork, the weaponization of legitimacy itself. The fountain pen proved mightier than the gun. cleaner, more profitable, harder to trace. And in demonstrating that truth, Dio changed organized crime forever, teaching a lesson that criminals continue learning, that institutions continue suffering from, that enforcement continues struggling to prevent. The paper trails he left behind told the story of power reimagined, not seized violently but assumed quietly, not defended with muscle but protected with lawyers, not destroyed in a blaze of gunfire but eroded gradually by systematic corruption. That was his legacy. Not bodies in the street, but institutions hollowed out, systems that claimed one purpose while serving another, and the enduring lesson that the most dangerous criminals are the ones who look legitimate until you examine the paperwork they're signing.